In this section of the webinar, we will outline some of the issues you should be aware of when discussing the preservation of electronic records. Later on, in another section of this workshop, we will cover many of these issues by offering suggestions on how to address each one of them. A recurring theme throughout this webinar is that many of the issues seen in preserving electronic information are really very similar to the issues seen in preservation of hard copy media, such as paper. These include the accessibility of the content, the authenticity of the material, as well as the preservation process, provenance and the ownership of the material, security of the media and the delivery or viewing vehicle, operational issues, including such items as policies and procedures, as well as legal and compliance matters. But obviously, electronic records do add some additional challenges, which we will discuss. As technology continues to advance, we have many more people using many more devices to create records. Not only is this the realm of desktop or laptop PCs, we have many more devices, such as video cameras and mobile devices, among other types, that allow individuals to create records. How do we know if these records should or should not be preserved? We also have the issue of the ease of creating copies of these documents, from multifunction digital copiers to inexpensive scanners to the ever-present email. All of these devices allow us to store records in many more places than ever before, spread across multiple servers to many types of removable media, from CD-ROM to USB flash drives. This chart represents an example of the significant growth we have all seen with electronic records. This compares the volume of electronic records stored by 3 presidential administrations. During the first Bush administration, approximately 200 gigabytes of electronic records were stored. This grew to 2,000 gigabytes, or 2 terabytes, of information during the Clinton years. In the second Bush administration, this grew to over 78 terabytes of records being stored. It is important to note that none of these administrations were thought to be close to the technological advancement seen in the Obama administration. Can you imagine what this chart will look like for future administrations? Unlike physical paper records, whose growth and the storage space they consume are right there in our face, electronic records are not so visible. All of this leads us to the awareness challenges. We need to be aware of what's out there. We obviously need to know the technological and operational challenges in preserving the various file formats and the numerous storage devices out there. But we also need to make others aware of the many issues. And this includes users, department heads, and senior administrators, among others. So what are the effects technology can have on preservation? The viability of the storage media is an obvious concern. This usually involves the durability of the media. For example, compare the durability of a floppy disk to that of a CD or DVD. While a CD or DVD may be considered more durable, the information contained on these can be destroyed with a simple scratch on the disk. We also have to be aware that the storage media itself becomes obsolete as higher capacity storage devices are introduced. How many organizations still use punch cards, or the type of laserdisc mentioned during the Doomsday Project discussion earlier in this workshop? This chart shows the approximate years in which common storage media was introduced, as well as when the media could have been considered obsolete. Note that these years are approximate, and determining exactly the date a particular media became obsolete is very subjective. While CDs are still very commonplace today, how long do you think these still will be used? How about DVDs or USB flash drives? While the physical media may last for many years, will the device that reads the media still be readily available to read the content stored on that media? This includes a computer having the proper operating system, the application software that runs on the operating system, as well as the interface cables and software device drivers that connect these pieces together. Not that long ago, serial and parallel cables were the most common interface between devices. Then SCSI interfaces provided a faster transfer method between devices and the computer. These once common interfaces are tough to find now, replaced by the USB cables and FireWire cables, among others. What type of interfaces will we be using tomorrow? As mentioned earlier, you also need all the software components to read and access the content stored on electronic media. While the operating system and application software are the most common, there are other smaller pieces of software that can easily be overlooked. The device drivers and the numerous updates and patches that seem to be continuously downloaded to our computers today, often unknowingly, seldom have a backup copy stored on a disk somewhere else. Typically, backup disks focus only on the data we create and not the application and the numerous patches that were downloaded since the original application installation. All of these components may be needed to recreate an environment that allows you to read the content stored on that electronic media. We are often short-sighted, thinking only within that moment or within recent history. As many of you know, manufacturers often change their own file format as new revisions come out to their applications in order to take advantage of new technology. While reading older file formats is common when these new versions come out, many times, due to the changes in technology, force manufacturers to stop supporting versions several generations old. For example, the current version of Microsoft Word cannot read Word versions 2 or 3 file formats. While I doubt many of us are still using version 2 of Microsoft Word, this is something to keep in mind in your preservation efforts. I am often asked, so which file format guarantees future readability? Unfortunately, there is not one single format that will absolutely guarantee readability over time, but there are several that will greatly reduce the risk that you'll end up with a file format that is unreadable in the decades to follow. The two primary concerns when it comes to file formats are the proprietary nature of the format as well as the use of compression techniques. A proprietary file format is one that was developed and is controlled by a single company. When one company owns a format, you have to be concerned on whether that organization will be around in the future. What happens if they go out of business? Who will then support the format? As technology changes, will the company continue to enhance the format as needed? Or more importantly, will the company support older versions as technology evolves and changes? The other area of concern relating to file format is the use of compression techniques to reduce the size of the file by removing data from the file. Using compression to reduce the overall size of the file produces a reduction in the total space required to store that file. Obviously, if a file is smaller, then you can store that much more in a given amount of space. For example, if you were to scan an 8.5 by 11 black and white letter in an uncompressed mode, this would result in a file size of approximately 1 megabyte. Using compression on the same page could result in a file as small as 35K to 50K in size. In other words, 3.5% to 5% of the size of the uncompressed file. The comparison in storage volumes are even more dramatic with color images. Since storing color images results in a larger overall file size, the use of compression to store these types of files is commonplace. An 8 megabyte color image can be reduced to under 80K in size, or less depending on the compression techniques and file format used. But the concern with using compression is more with the approach used. There are typically two types of approaches for compressing a file. Lossless is a technique where no data is lost when the file is compressed. it is recommended to use lossless compression for preservation copies. Lossy compression reduces a file by permanently removing certain information from within the file. As a result, lossy is not recommended for preservation use. You should note that the JPEG file format often used in digital photos uses lossy compression. You may want to consider JPEG 2000 file format instead, since this format uses the lossless approach of compression. This chart shows a small sample of some of the more popular file formats, including the type of file compression that could be used and which are considered open standards. Note that some of the formats can be both lossy and lossless. These are dependent on the settings within the application used to create that particular file. So do not always assume that a file format such as PDF image or Windows Media Format, that's the WMA file format, is using lossless compression.